Good evening. I'm Roscoe Lee Brown.
Welcome to the Urban Agenda.
Critical race theory. Now, critical race theory, I must say, to begin with, I hadn't heard the term probably a year ago. Now I hear it every day.
Causes me to think the reality is no one is even asking the question, much less trying to answer it.
I think Americans are just starting to hear it. And I think no one knows exactly what it is. They know it has something to do with race, and it's some kind of a theory. Right?
And that's probably a pretty sad but accurate way of summarizing where we've gone in the last 20 years.
And here we go again.
How would you describe it? And then we'll ask, how would you describe it? What is critical race theory?
Confronting authority, reflections of an ardent protester.
I will admit that I read a lot of critical race theory in law school. So, you know, the work of Derrick Bell or Gene Stefancic
This is
and
the
Richard
stuff
Delgado.
no one knows but you and 6 other people.
Right. So,
but what matters is, what is it?
I think that we are looking at a repeat of a century ago when historians indicated that this was the Black Nadir during the 1890s, the first decade or so into the 20th century. And we seem to be repeating it for some of the same reasons. It's very easy to conclude that, well, conclusions were made in the Plessy v. Ferguson decision, right, that blacks have enough rights that the Constitution could provide. Now it's up to them to pick themselves up.
and that any sort of neutral system is, in fact, a guise for racial power. And so the argument is made by Derrick Bell, for example, that Brown versus Board of Education, this is an argument he made in 1991, that Brown versus Board of Education was actually a way for the white community to leverage its own power. It wasn't an attempt to end segregation in public schools. Even things that are purportedly good in terms of race, so long as they uphold these broader systems, things like capitalism or things like the meritocracy, these things are actually just guises for power.
Just how deep is it? To scratch the surface of this skin-deep problem, PBL now offers part of a test prepared by a social worker from the ghetto of Watts in Los Angeles. The social worker, Mr. Adrian Dove, was struck by the fact that low-income black men were required to do well on tests keyed to middle-class experience and educational standards. So Mr. Dove decided to put the shoe on the other foot by writing a test for middle-class Americans, both white and black.
And so what that boils down to in sort of practical terms is all disparity equals discrimination. If you can see any stat where black people are underperforming white people, this means the system was set up for the benefit of white people, and that white people have a duty to tear down these systems in order to alleviate the racism that's implicit in those systems. When it comes to schools, what this tends to boil down to is kids who are white have experienced privilege because the system was built for white people, and we have to change the standards.
Right.
Oh, yeah, that's the easiest thing to say. I mean, if I could get that message across, you could carry me away. I would think that my mission as a teacher were complete. But it is very tough. It's been very tough throughout history. How would you have gone about getting the white indentured servants, formerly indentured, now the yeomen, during the middle 1600s when slavery was just getting underway? How could you convince them that they were being sold a bill of goods by the plantation owners who said, hey, we're going to reduce these blacks to lifetime indentured slavery, and you got to stand with us in case they try to escape or revolt? To deflect the attention from their own failed policies to the traditional scapegoat, black people.
And here we go again.
Now, okay, well, so Malcolm, you tell me your definition.
Oh, I agree with everything he just said.
Oh, great.
And I appreciate you being honest in defining of what it's like to be black American.
And here we go again. Now, given some of the reports that particularly the wages for people of middle and moderate means and working class people perhaps will not grow again in our lifetimes, what does that portend for the nature of race relations?
Well, I think
how do you fight that?
Right? That is, I mean, we're talking about a system.
That's unfair.
No, I'm just saying I agree with all of those suppositions because they are grounded in truth.
And here we go again.
There's a certain sort of crystallized version of it that is a lot less complex than what critical race theory actually is. But critical race theory essentially argues that racism is baked into all the systems of American society.
To see how well they understood the special culture of the ghetto. With each question, you will be given 4 choices from which to select an answer. You'll be given the correct answer at the end of each question. So if you have a piece of paper and pencil handy, simply mark down the numbers 1 to 10 and take the test. And now for the first question.
What went wrong? Clearly we were, when I was coming along with Lonnie Guinier and the rest, we thought we were part of the movement that was going to change America.
I did too. In fact, when I graduated from law school in 1957, I went up to see Judge William Hastie, the first black federal judge, a very sophisticated man. And I told him in my interest of being a civil rights lawyer, he said, Derrick, praiseworthy, but you were 15 years too late. The Brown decision has been decided. There's some mopping up to be done. What happens throughout history, though, David, is that during economic good times or during national crises, the recognition of the need for blacks to have basic rights increases. During economic bad times, it goes down. During the latter part of the 19th century, you could almost trace the economic conditions in various southern regions by the number of blacks reported lynched. Now, we don't have the lynching today of the same form, but as Americans generally become, understandably, anxious because of the loss of jobs, their unwillingness, even Business Week had a cover story last week about the inaccuracy of government statistics. And we have that same pattern down through history. We have it again today, where the reaction to the wholesale shipment of jobs out of the country, the wholesale importation of legal and illegal aliens, the downsizing, the automation, the response to all of that is, well, it must be affirmative action. And people buy it.
I guess it's not accidental, and I've heard this discussed, that at this very time you suddenly hear sort of these bizarre quasi-scientific notions of black inferiority starting to come to the fore again.
Periodic. I was down in Athens, Georgia last week delivering the Hunter Holmes lecture honoring Charlene Hunter Gauld and Hamilton Holmes, who integrated the University of Georgia in 1961. I can't believe that much time has gone. I was a junior attorney working on that case back here in New York. But in any event, I was reminded that also in 1961, there was a Savannah school case that I was working on. And the school board hired all of these, in quotes, experts to come in and put on testimony, which the local judge allowed them to put on, proving that blacks were genetically inferior. Included in that material was IQ test results. And the argument was that Brown should be rejected because the court hadn't considered the fact that blacks were inherently inferior, as these tests showed. Well, the courts rejected it at the time, but there's been a periodic falling back to these kinds of tests. You know, it's the interesting comment I want to make about the Charles Murray book.
Right.
Is that since his bottom line is really, let's get rid of welfare, let's get rid of affirmative action, let's put blacks back clearly into the corner, that he could have made those same arguments even if he had manipulated the data the other way from the way he manipulated, and came out and said, well, blacks are 15 points higher than any white.
And therefore need nothing.
That's right. So he could have used the same argument. So it's not the IQ test.
Right.
It's what's behind, what is the force behind, and that is, it's just an anti-black theme.
It's interesting how people, we have no historical memory sometimes, and clearly there are other ethnic groups in the United States who have suffered similarly. For instance, I did my senior thesis at Yale Law School on Chinese exclusion. And much of that, the passage of legislation that prevented the Chinese from immigrating was based upon scientific evidence. The scientific evidence at that time, at the turn of the century, however, was phrenology. And it showed, based upon the bumps on the heads of Chinese, by great experts, most of them at Yale, by the way, that they were prone to violence and sexual assaults. And that was used as part of the justification for not clamping down on the number of Chinese coming into the United States.
Well, Jews face the same problem.
Absolutely. And the Irish.
IQ test and what have you. So it's nothing new.
Right.
I think it doesn't make it less dangerous.
Understood.
Given the media's willingness to pick it up and the media is functioning based on what they think their audiences
wants to hear,
and they give it to them.
Look, you know, and the funny thing is, it's not just African Americans, right? It's also the Scalp Act of 1749, where for $300 modern dollars, you had to cut off the head or the hair of an Indian to prove that you've got them out of the way so they could settle. That's a little bit of American history that people should know about. The Chinese Exclusion Acts of the 1840s. These are things we don't talk about.
Now here's another saying that you'll hear in the inner city, ghetto or slum or whatever you call it. Let's see if you know the answer to question 5, which goes, if a man is called a handkerchief head, he is A, cool cat, B, a porter, C, an Uncle Tom, D, a preacher. Time's up, Master. And in case you haven't guessed, the answer is C. A handkerchief head is an Uncle Tom.
I see Mr. Murray's book is number 3 on the bestseller list now, and I think obviously that portends for quite a struggle. Let's talk about what we do now. Clearly, African Americans and other subjected groups have never laid down and let this happen easily. What do progressives, what do people who don't like this kind of America that's starting to build, which, as you say, won't only sweep down poor blacks and Latinos, but will hurt a lot of other people? What do people start to do to confront these issues?
I think that there is in any catastrophe, there is opportunity. And I think that the results in the election last week, some of these other developments that we're talking about, serve as a wake-up call for an awful lot of people of color, as well as whites who are progressive but perhaps have been sitting down on the job or bemoaning the fate of where even the people they elect have gone. That this means a massive effort of self-help, beginning with the individual. In my book, I talk about what happens to the individual protester, the person that stands up when everybody else is sitting down, who speaks out when everyone else is silent. Well, basically, it's not good. Those in power retaliate.
Right.
Those who you would hope would align themselves with you back off and perhaps become hostile. Nevertheless, there are marvelous values in standing up. And rather than wait until new leaders come forth, until new organizations are formed, I think that the invitation out there now is that in whatever way we can, we as individuals need to reach out and do what we can to start moving things in the other direction. Well, you say, what can one person do? Well, it's amazing what one person can do once they're willing to do it. People say to me, well, Bell, you gave up your job at Harvard. Have they hired anybody up there? The answer is no. They said, well, then you lost. I said, no, I didn't lose. A whole generation of students, not only at Harvard, but at law schools across the country, know what I stood up for. And whether they're willing to do it right now or not, they know that that is an option that has been given to them not simply in lecture form or preachment form, but through example.
And why, here they are, America's #1 aunt and uncle. One of the familiar phrases in the Negro community for how to get ahead is a phrase which we want you to complete. So for question 6, complete the following sentence. Quote, you've got to get up early in the morning to A, catch worms, B, be healthy, wealthy, and wise, C, fool me, D, be the first one on the street. The answer is C. You've got to get up early in the morning to fool me.
First of all, it's not true that people don't talk about these things. We all did learn about...
You don't want them talked about?
No, that's not true either.
You want to cancel them?
No, Malcolm, I'm sorry, you're lying. That's lying.
That's just lying.
It is lying.
Then we respectfully submit that in the jargon of the social worker who wrote the test, you may well be culturally deprived.
Thank you, Professor Bell. It's been very instructive.
Thank you very much.
Today, some 40 years after the birth of the Civil Rights Movement, we're still struggling with race issues in America. To write off even the least of its people diminishes all of us. This is David R. Jones. Thank you for joining me on the Urban Agenda.